the capital of Bohemia, today the capital of the Czech Republic. It's one of the oldest Jewish communities in Europe. It's still functioning today, even though there are a small number of Jews. Though, as the Rav of Prague told me personally 2 years ago, that there are probably 50,000 people, he said, in Prague that have some Jewish blood. But because of things that we will discuss that occurred in the 19th and 20th centuries, there are half Jews, quarter Jews, Jews who don't know they are Jews, hidden Jews. Prague is a microcosm of all of the tragedies that have happened in the Jewish world, especially in the last 2 centuries. The Jews were in Prague in the 10th century, in the 900s. We already have a record that there were over 300 Jewish families in Prague. And it's interesting that whereas the Jews in Germany mainly were in the Rhineland and in Spires and Worms and Mainz, they were the Talmidim of Rabbeinu Gershom, Meor Agolo, and that's where Rashi got his start before moving back to France. The Jews in Prague came directly to Prague from Babylonia. And Prague is on the river, and it was an important trading post on the river in Roman times already, and therefore it was a natural place for a city to be developed. And wherever cities were developed in the Middle Ages, Jews attempted to live within cities rather than in small communities. There's a pendulum in the Jewish world. In Eastern Europe, Jews lived in small towns and not in cities. And they didn't come to the cities until the 19th century. But in Western Europe, Jews always lived in cities, simply because of the fact that the cities offered them, so to speak, more protection for the regular ongoing persecution and pogroms that were visited upon Jews by the church and by the noble people who control the governments in the cities. So the Jews not only lived in the cities, they always lived near the cathedral. They always lived near the big church, again, because that was a place of protection. Because as many times it was the church that saved the Jews by opening its gates and allowing the Jews to find refuge in the church compound or in the monastery compound until the mob's fury abated. And therefore, wherever you go throughout Europe, in Spain you'll see it, and you'll see it in Provence, and you'll see it also in here in Bohemia, the Jewish quarter was always hard by the main churches and the cathedrals. Now that was not necessarily true in Prague, because the great Prague Cathedral was built on one side of the river, and the Jewish community was on the other side of the river. But when the Prague Cathedral, which took about 200 years to build, and if anyone who has been to Prague, it's one of the architectural sites that always is shown, the same stonemasons and builders who built that cathedral built the Altnai Shul. Because the Jews said, as long as they're here, the Altnai Shul was built, so to speak, by stonemasons who moonlighted. It was a second job, a third job. We don't know exactly when the Altnai Shul was built. It existed in the 1100s already. It's the oldest functioning synagogue, continuously functioning with the exception of the period of the Nazis, probably in the world. It's 900 years. And why it was called the Altnai Shul, there are various interpretations. One that's probably the most logical is that originally it was the Alt Shul, it was the old shul, and then they refurbished it. It's been refurbished many times over the centuries, as you can imagine. It was just finished a refurbishing job now itself again. So now they have air conditioning and heating, which in the 1100s was scarce. And they fixed over the shul. So when it was renovated, so then it was called the Nai Shul, but the new shul, the new synagogue. But then they combined it and called it the Alt Nai Shul because there was another shul that was called the Alt Shul that they never refurbished, and it remained the old shul, so this was the old new shul. It's a theory, it's as good a theory as any. And the Jews in Prague suffered horrible things, and as I mentioned when we discussed Frankfurt am Main last week, Jews are tenacious people. And no matter how many times they got thrown out of Prague, and no matter how many times the non-Jewish population burned down the Jewish quarter, and no matter how high the taxes became, and how unbearable life was, the Jews always returned to Prague. So that we have on record that the Jews were expelled at least 6 times from Prague. But the Jews always came back. And in spite of everything, the Jews prospered in Prague. They prospered economically, they prospered socially, and they certainly prospered in Torah. Prague has a record of Rabbonim, of great Talmidei Chachomim, great scholars, great rabbinic leaders, almost unmatched by any other community in the world. And it was a continuous line, and people went out of their way to find the position in Prague. So we will find that some of the greatest Jewish leaders, rabbinic leaders who were rabbis in other communities, always managed somehow to do a few years stint in Prague. Now, I don't know whether Prague was the stepping stone to greater positions or it was the greater position. But the roster of people, as I hope I'll discuss with you in a few moments, that were Rabbonim in Prague really is unmatched in the Jewish world. The Jews were there in the Middle Ages, as I mentioned. And in 1338, there were 80 Jewish families in Prague. Charles IV, who became the emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, he extended rights to the Jews, and he is the one who brought the Jews into the money lending business. As I discussed with you when we talked about Frankfurt am Main, the money lending business was really forced upon Jews because of constraints of the church, that they did not want to have Christian money lenders, and because of the fact that the noblemen were the only ones that had money, and the only way money makes money is by having it circulate. And the interest rates in the Middle Ages were usurious. They were enormous. I mean, 35, 40% was normal. So that nobody ever paid off a loan. You couldn't almost if you took a great amount of money. And so the Jews would borrow money from the noblemen at 25% or at 30%, and they would lend it out at 40%, and the 10% in the middle was their spread, was their profit, but it also had to include the fact that every so often, or very often, like Bank Leumi, the debts were uncollectible, and you were stuck with it. And so all of that had to be factored in. Again, you have to realize that nobody loves a banker. And certainly nobody loves a money lender, especially when the money lender is taking 40% interest on the loan. So the Jews socially were forced into a profession that guaranteed, even if they wouldn't be Jewish, it guaranteed enmity, it guaranteed jealousy, it guaranteed that people would resent it. And that always contributed to the fact that and the illiterate Christian mob always contributed to the fact that the danger of a pogrom was instantaneous. It was right around the corner at any time, and any little thing would touch it off. And in the history of Prague, there are 4 or 5 little things that happened, each one of which led to a tremendous pogrom. For instance, on Good Friday in 1389, Jewish children from the Cheder threw stones at a procession of Christians marching in the Good Friday parade. It was a common thing in the Middle Ages that they would carry a crucifix, and people would have wooden crosses on their back, or they would whip themselves in commemoration of Good Friday, of the fact that that was the anniversary, so to speak, of the crucifixion of Jesus by the Romans. And so at this procession, so there's a wild kid from Cheder, whom we all know. He lives next door to us. He's still throwing stones today, except today he's throwing them at Jews. You know, he's burning the garbage in Meir Shorim or other things, right? He's got nothing to do with himself. So the kid threw a stone, right? Well, don't ask. 3,000 Jews died because of that stone. Because this was Easter weekend, and the preachers in the church on Easter Sunday preached about the malevolence of the Jews and the fact that they were guilty of the crucifixion and everything else. And therefore, on Easter Monday, there was a pogrom that killed 3,000 Jews in Prague and left almost no one unscathed, no Jew unscathed in the community. Not only that, but after the pogrom, so then the houses are looted, all the money is taken. Interesting that the government of Bohemia recorded that they confiscated 5 tons of silver from the Jewish community. So the Jewish community was not poor. And the tons of silver reflected itself in the Judaica and the other things that Jews had, and also reflected itself in the fact that since paper money didn't exist yet in Europe, paper money was a later invention that came from China. So you needed silver, gold, you needed coins that were that had value in order to be able to do business. And as I mentioned, the Jews were the money lenders, so they had silver. And all of that was confiscated and taken from them. There's a piyut, really a slicha, that is recited, that was recited, and may still be recited. There's a nusach of Bohemia, just like there's a nusach of Ashkenaz, a ritual of prayer of Ashkenaz, and a ritual of prayer of Spain, wherever Jews went in the world. So the basic form of the prayer service was the same, but there are nuances of difference always. And this was called Bohem, and this was their nusach. And there's a special slicha which is recited until today, which commemorates the terrible events of 1389 rather, in Prague, this great pogrom that almost wiped out the Jewish community. It's called Et Kol Atla'a Ra'iti. I saw all of this. The author is Rabbi Victor Kara, and it's a tremendous dirge, a poem of sadness over the destruction of the Prague Jewish community. However, as I mentioned, the Jews are tenacious. 4 years later, in 1393, the Jewish community is back. And the king offers them protection, as does the archbishop. Apparently, part of the reason was that they simply couldn't get along without the Jews. They didn't find reliable people to make money lenders. And the Jews also were merchants And the Jews had systems of credit that they invented. Again, you have to imagine the Middle Ages, if you wanted to buy something, you had to bring coin. One of the reasons why in the Middle Ages in Christian Europe the commerce of the country never developed is because of the fact that, you know, if you wanted to come and buy a building, you had to come with a wheelbarrow full of silver, right? Who could bring it, who could take it? And as early as the 10th and 11th centuries, we have records that Jews already wrote out what we would call today a check. You know, they'd say, Yankel, give Yossel, 100 florins and I'll pay you. And Yankel would do it because so you didn't have to walk around with 100 florins. And Jews had letters of credit, and Jews always had relatives. And they trusted their relatives, something which has waned today. But there was a time when you could rely on the fact that Yossel would give the 100 and Yankel would pay him back, and there wouldn't be a problem. And you see that reflected in the shilas and shuvas of the time, because once in a while there was somebody that, you know, he said, Lo yadvorim olam lahadam, I don't know what you're talking about, right? They never saw it. And they produced a check. And he said he doesn't know from it, and he didn't sign it, and you'll see that the rabbis were especially harsh and especially strong in enforcing these things, even when it was in doubt. Because usually the halacha is, Hamotzi mechavero olav haraya. You want to collect money, you got to prove it. The best thing in the world is to have the money in your pocket. That's the best taina in the world. I've got the money. The other person has to get it from me. But here, the rabbis, so to speak, took an opposite tack because they wanted to preserve the ability to do commercial transactions, and which was the Jewish livelihood, and therefore they had to defend the fact that when a person sent a check, it would be honored and he would be repaid. And therefore it's like a takana, it's like a special law that the rabbis made over and above the halacha to make certain that the wheels of commerce would be oiled and that Jews would make a living. In 1497, the Jews, a law was passed restricting interest to 20%. 20% you couldn't make money, which in effect meant that the Jews were going to be forced out of the money lending business. And the king of Bohemia, see, it went like this. There were kings of Bohemia, and then part of the time Prague belonged to Poland, so there were kings of Poland that came there, and then again the Bohemians took over, and then later the Austrians took over, and the French took over, and the Swedish conquered it. It was always going back and forth. And every time you got new kings, so it depends, how frum he was. It depends how religious he was, how much he was under the influence of the church, and how practical he was also. So many times, unfortunately, ideology overrides practicality. We're witness to it here in our beloved land, how ideology overrides practicality. Anyone who lived in the Soviet Union knows how ideology overrode practicality. So the ideology is that the collective farm is perfect because Marx said it was perfect, or the kibbutz is perfect. And the practicality is that it doesn't work. Even when the people work, the system doesn't work. If you'll add to it the fact that the people don't work, so then you have what the Soviet Union looked like. And so at 20%, the Jews couldn't make money. So then all of it dried up. And then the whole economy dried up because there was no money being borrowed, no money being lent, no money being invested. And then when that happened, so then the king had to relent and change it again. But if you're living in that time, let's say you're living in that 20-year span when you can't lend money at more than 20%, so then what do? You starve. That's basically what you do. And the fact that in history 20 years is nothing is a little comfort to you if it's your 20 years. If it's the 20 years that you're in business. In 1502, the Jews were again exiled from Prague, thrown out of Prague. Also on a crazy story, there was a Jew that was demented. He was insane. He was a meshuggah. So every community has, sometimes they're hard to identify, but every Jewish community has demented people. Some of them even get elected to public office. But every Jewish community has demented people, and he was a demented person, and he said that the Lord appeared to him, and he killed a Christian child with a stone. So then you had the blood libel, and then you had everything. So he was tortured to death publicly, but the Jewish people were thrown out of Prague. Because how could it be that there would be a demented Jew? The Jews, they purposely got this guy to do it because they needed the Christian child, they needed the blood for the matzahs, the whole baloney, the whole story. So the Jews are gone. By 1518, they're back again. Another Jewish community. And this time, they made a deal, it's almost funny, except it's not funny, that they made an arrangement that they paid the government in Prague that the next time they're thrown out, the government should take care of the Jewish cemetery, and it should take care of the mikveh, and take care of the matzah bakery, so that when they come back, it'll be ready for them. And we have recorded in the records, they paid 50 shlak, which was a Bohemian coin, annually to the city fathers. And this was the agreement, that whenever the Jews had to leave, they would take care of the cemetery, and and it's interesting that they did take care of the cemetery. That's why the cemetery is still there today. It's one of the oldest Jewish cemeteries in the world. There's graves that we know that go back to the 1200s. Because the government took care of it. I have another true story that, in line with this, that there was a certain congregation in Detroit, Michigan. So in Detroit, for a period of time, unfortunately, Jewish neighborhoods changed every 15, 20, 25 years. So there was a synagogue that had a magnificent structure in the original Jewish neighborhood. When the neighborhood changed, so they sold it to a black church. And they moved out to the new neighborhood and built another magnificent structure. Well, that lasted about 20 years, and then that neighborhood changed. So the same black church came and bought the second synagogue, and now the Jews moved out and built the third time, an enormous, beautiful synagogue. So the pastor of the church came to the rabbi and said, we'd like to have representation on the building committee because eventually, we have a few ideas of what we need here. So, that's a bitter joke, but it's true. But here also is a bitter joke. The Jews know they're going to get thrown out, but they made an arrangement. You'll take care of it while we're being thrown out. When we come back, we won't have to start all over again. Now, in Prague, there was such a thing called the Jew flag. If you go into the Altnai Shul, on the bima, on the balemer of the shul, in one of the corners, there's a flag. And the flag has on it the picture of a hat, which was the symbol of the Jewish community. So that hat was originally a Swedish hat, and the Jews helped defend the city of Prague against the Swedes. And they were awarded this flag by the king of Bohemia as a commemoration of the fact that they defended the city ably against, but the hat was yellow. And the yellow hat in Prague was a Jewish hat. And the Jews, all male Jews, had to wear a yellow hat with a peak. That it came to a peak. Now, for instance, if you see in the Jewish world, there are certain Chassidim that wear always yarmulkes that come to a peak. The Ger Chassidim especially, but you see it by other Chassidims too. Where does that come from? All of this comes from the fact that Jews, when they were forced to do something, turned what was supposed to be derogatory and insulting to them, they turned it into a badge of pride. I mean, it's part of the hang-up that the Jews have with hats. The hat. I mean, this is the only country in the world people walk around in the rain with garbage bags on their head to protect the hat, which is supposed to protect the head. But what is the significance of hats? The significance of hats is that Jews were forced to wear hats. So you see in all the illustrations of the Middle Ages, Jews are wearing dunce caps, Jews are wearing funny hats, Jews wear hats of a certain color. So again, the Jews said, you're laughing at us, man, we're going to show you, that's the hat we wear. That's the way we are. And so therefore, this yellow peaked cap, which is represented on the flag, is the Jew hat of Prague. Jews had to wear a yellow scarf around their shoulders. Women had to wear either a yellow head covering or some sort of yellow sash in order to indicate they were Jewish. Jews wore it, and they wore it as a matter of pride. And this flag, the Jew flag, at every Jewish procession, the flag came forth. Now that's something that didn't exist. Jews didn't have flags until much later, the Zionist period, etc. We don't find flags in Eastern Europe. But here in Bohemia, in Prague, the institution of the Jewish flag was very, very prideful. And we have paintings of the time. They always show the Jews marching in the procession with the Sefer Torah, with a chuppah, and someone carrying the flag as representative of the Jewish community. For instance, when Louis II, who was the last Polish king of Bohemia, was crowned, so the Jews came to greet him as was the custom, and the custom always was that for a king or for a leader, you always brought the Sefer Torah. The Jews carried the Sefer Torah outwards. We have pictures from even as late in the 20th century, when cardinals came to certain towns in Poland, the Rav came out with the Sefer Torah to greet them. That was part of the understanding, was part of the servility of the Jews that you had to do it. I always tell the story, it's a digression, but that in the house of the Nasi and the house of Katsav here, of our president, in the main auditorium where all the diplomats of the world receive their credentials, they're accredited to the state of Israel. So in the corner, there's no furniture in the room, except for in the corner there is a small Kodesh. There's a small Ark of the Law with a little Sefer Torah in it. That Sefer Torah was presented by the Jews of Bobroisk in Lithuania to the Tsar Nicholas II in 1905. The Tsar visited, and the Jewish community came out, and as a sign of loyalty to the Tsar, whom they hated, they gave him a Sefer Torah. So the Tsar didn't know what to do with a Sefer Torah, right? But it was stored with all of the Romanov treasures. I am always reminded that when Abba Eben and Weitzman gave Harry Truman Sefer Torah, which is in the Truman Library in Independence, Missouri, They gave him a Sefer Torah in honor and in recognition of everything that he did for the state of Israel. So Truman, the Missouri farmer, took the Sefer Torah and he said, "Gee, I always wanted one of these." So if you go to the Truman Library in Independence, Missouri, you'll see there's a beautiful Oren Kodesh with a Sefer Torah, and they're really Bakovidik, and but that was the thing. So here, Babrois, they gave it to the Tsar. Well, when the revolution came and the communists had no money, so they financed themselves the first year. They took all of the Tsar's money, his treasures, they looted everything, and they sold it. And so in 1936, in London, in an antique store, there's a Sefer Torah with an ark in the window. The Tsar's Sefer Torah. And a Jew walks by, a wealthy Jew from London, and he sees the Sefer Torah in the window. He says, "I can't leave the Sefer Torah here." He goes in and he buys it. And then when Shazar, this is his chair, when Zalman Shazar was president of the state of Israel, they built finally this beautiful house, the Bet HaNasi, so he presented it to the president of the state of Israel as a memorandum, as a gift, a memorial gift, that it should be. So that Sefer Torah stands in the hall where all of the ambassadors of the world come to present their credentials to the president of the state of Israel. But it started out as a Sefer Torah being given to the Tsar. So I always say, the Chazal say in the Medrash, that Akol tzrichim lamazel. Everybody needs good luck. Afilu Sefer Torah shebeheichel. Even the Sefer Torah that is in the ark, it's a matter of luck. So it's a simple explanation. It's a matter of luck is which one you use, when you use it, etc. But here you see the Medrash in front of your eyes. This Sefer Torah had mazel. The Tsar is gone, the communists are gone, everybody's gone, and it's sitting in Yerushalayim in the Bet HaNasi. In Prague, there was a Jew that came from Italy by the name of Sansino, from the famous family of printers. And in the 1500s, we have a Jewish printing press in Prague, established by the Sansino family. And in fact, Prague was the center of Jewish printing long before other places in Europe, except for Italy. Italy was the main center, and then Salonika was a center. But in the Ashkenazic world, Prague was the center because of the Sansino family. In 1506, the Jews are expelled again. And the Jews came back. In 1566 they were expelled. They come back in 1585. We already have a large Jewish community living in Prague again. In 1620, a Jew was accused of selling stolen items stolen from the church, from the palace of the prince. And in order to save this Jew from being tortured to death and executed, the Jewish community then paid an enormous amount of money to redeem him. So we see that somehow Prague was not a poor Jewish community, but it was always an extorted Jewish community. They always suffered from the fact that they had to keep on paying off either to exist, to remain there, or to come back, or to save Jewish lives. The Jewish ghetto was destroyed by fire maybe 15 times. Many of the times it was arsonists that set fire to it, and many times it was simply the conditions. So what happened was that the Jews in Prague were the firemen. They were the expert firemen in town, and that became a Jewish profession. So that when anything was burning in Prague, they would say, bring the Jews. They're the ones that know how to put out the fire. And so, again, a strange combination of the relationship between the Jews and the non-Jews. We have a famous incident which you can see today on the St. Charles Bridge over the river. In 1690, again, a Jewish child threw a stone on this bridge, on the St. Charles Bridge. There are statues of saints all along the bridge, sculptured statues of saints, Christian icons, crucifixes, etc. And this was in the 16th and 17th centuries, and it was considered to be an honor to donate such an icon, to donate such a statue, etc. Anyway, a Jewish child again went by, and he threw a stone that chipped off one of the noses or ears on the crucifix. And in order to prevent the pogrom that was undoubtedly going to happen, the King of Bohemia ordered that the Jews should put on that crucifix the Hebrew lettering Kodosh, 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 Hashem Tzvokos Meloch Haaretz Kvodo, in gold lettering. It's still there today, because he said that now that the Shem HaMforish was there, no Jew would throw a stone anymore. When Czechoslovakia became independent in the early 1990s, when it finally broke away from communism, so the president of Czechoslovakia, Vladislav Havel, who is from the Chasidei Umos HaOlam, he considered removing that because he said it was shameful. But he consulted with his cabinet and with the, I guess the people that are in charge of landmarks and public buildings, etc., and they said, but this is part of our history. And that by preserving it, they felt that it would do more good than by removing it. So it is still there today. And you can see it on the St. Charles Bridge. But that was done in order to prevent the pogrom. They had to do something because of the mobs. So that was the penance, was having that inscription put on the crucifix. There was a famous family in Prague in the 1600s called the Meisel family. Their coat of arms showed a mouse, which is Meisel, right? And very, very wealthy family. The biggest banker. And as happens with wealthy people, he built his own synagogue, which is still there today, the Meisel synagogue, because he didn't want to daven with the riffraff who were in the other synagogues. And so there's the Meisel synagogue. And he built the famous town hall, the Jewish town hall, the Rathaus, which has the clock on it. And the clock is in Hebrew letters, and it goes counterclockwise, which is a Jewish idea, that why should it go this way when it can go that way? And it's one of, these are all famous sites in Prague. I mean, Prague today is an enormous tourist center. It's after Paris, it's the largest tourist center in Europe, and most of the tourist sites are the Jewish quarter. The ancient cemetery, the Altnai Shul, and then there's naturally next to the cathedral on top of the hill, the Prague Cathedral, there's a medieval village that has been preserved intact exactly as it was. But in the Jewish quarter is an enormous draw, not just for Jews, but for anyone that comes to Prague. And this clock and the Rathaus that was built by Meisels in the 1600s remains there until today. And interestingly enough, what happened in Prague is something that didn't happen in most other places. I mean, the Czech people were somehow the Czech government between the wars, between the First World War and the Second World War, was really the only country in Europe that lived up to equal rights to Jews, that attempted at least to have Jews not discriminated against. And now, too, there's a feeling towards it. So they restored Jewish property. They gave it back to the Jews. They gave it back to so the entire Jewish community there today, for instance, is supported not by the outside and not by donations. It's supported by the property that was given back to it. And so there's substantial holdings from which they have income and that they're able to deal with. So in this ancient building, there's a dining hall, and there's like an old age thing, and all sorts of things that are being used by this small Jewish community, about 1,500 Jews today. And sometimes they say as many as 5,000. It always fluctuates. But the community has the advantage of the fact that it has property, it has assets. The cemetery, we find graves, as I mentioned, in the early 1200s. Now, the problem with the cemetery was that it was small and self-contained, and therefore, after a period of time, the cemetery fills up. So what was done was that when the cemetery filled up, they brought topsoil and spread it on top of existing graves, and then buried on top. So the cemetery is layer upon layer upon layer. And that's why you see this tremendous forest of monuments. It's surrealistic to visit the cemetery. It really is. It's just boggles the mind. But what they did is they picked up the monuments and they put them down. So you have no guarantee that the name on the monument is over the grave of that person, even though that person is undoubtedly in that cemetery. And that cemetery was not closed till late 1700s when the second cemetery was built. It's called the New Cemetery. And that cemetery is famous because the Noda B'Yehuda, Rabbi Cheskel Alevi Landau, is buried in the New Cemetery, and they stopped burying in the old cemetery. And then there's a third cemetery now that was built, that's the one that's used now mainly for later periods of time. Now, let's just talk about some of the great Rabbonim that were in Prague, which really made Prague special. The great Maharal of Prague, Lo, Ben Betzalel, he founded a whole school called the Prague School. The Prague School were people who combined Kabbalah, ideas of Kabbalah, of mysticism, with philosophy. It's a rare combination, and the Maharal's works are an example of this type of scholarship. But there are his Talmidim, Rabbi Yosef, Shlomo Yosef Lenshitz, the Kliyokar, the Shalom was the Rav in Prague, Reb Sheftel Horowitz was in Prague, Yashar Mikandia, the famous Joseph Solomon del Megiddo, was in Prague, Reb Yom Tov Lippin Heller, the Teisvus Yontov, was the Rav in Prague, Reb Yonason Eibeshitz, so he was called Reb Yonason Prager, he was the Rav in Prague. By the way, the name Prager, Prager, always refers to the fact that originally somebody came from Prague. The great Rav in Prague in modern times, in the 1700s, was Rabbi Cheskel Alevi Landau, the Noda B'Yehuda. The Noda B'Yehuda became the Rav in Prague when he was 28 years old. He was a tremendous scholar. He became the Posek Ador, and he was a very, very strong person. And he lasted a long time in Prague. He stayed there till his death. So he was the Rav there for 40 years. And there's a famous legend about him. There's always legends about great rabbis. They say that when he came for the tryout, for the interview, and so Prague was, they were used to great Rabbonim, and he was so young, and he was nervous. So one of the things in the interview for Rabbonim traditionally was that they would set a table that had all sorts of fruits, vegetables, nuts, drinks, cake, and see if he knew how to make the brachas in the correct order. That was a traditional way of testing the rabbi. So in his nervousness, he took a fruit and he made the bracha boi priyaitz. So the president of the community, he said, Rabbi, he said, Mizonos. Cake is here, right? Mazonos takes precedence. So the Noda B'Yehuda said, I don't eat cake. And the rest of his life, he never ate a piece of cake because he didn't want to be accused of a falsehood. I heard that story from Rabbi Yankov Kamenetsky, Zecher Tzadik Levrocha, about himself, that when he was first married, and the first Pesach, he was by his mother-in-law for Pesach, and she made knedlach that were howitzer cannonballs. I mean, they were impossible to be eaten. And he saw what was happening, and he said he always had a delicate stomach, so when she served the knedlach, he said, I don't eat gebrokts. And he never ate gebrokts for the next 70 years on Pesach, even though he was a Litvak, and the Litvaks all eat gebrokts, because he once said to her, in order to save himself from her knedlach, that he doesn't eat gebrokts. So that's, he said he never eat cake, so that's it. He doesn't eat cake. He didn't eat cake the rest of his life, which is not a bad idea. The Noda B'Yehuda is a fascinating person. First of all, he was second only to the Gaon of Vilna in his opposition to Hasidus. Tremendous opponent of the Hasidic movement. And therefore, that already set him up as a controversial person. Chassidim like to say, I've heard it from many Chassid, that he did tshuva before the end of his life. Maybe. He lived at a time when the Haskalah was taking hold in Eastern Europe. And he had a son-in-law, Shlomo Yehuda Rappaport, who was called Shir. One of the things that the Maskilim did is they called themselves by acronyms, by abbreviations. That was the style. So his name was Shir, Shin Yud Reish, Shlomo Yehuda Rappaport. Now Rappaport was a great Gaon. He was a tremendous Gaon. We find some of his writings in the second volume of the Tshuvas of the Noda B'Yehuda. He appears there, and he appears in the introduction to the Avnei Miluim, which is also written by I'm sorry, not the Tzlach, which was also written by the Noda B'Yehuda. But he was a maskil. He was a completely observant Jew. He was a great Talmud Chacham, but he was a maskil. He held from secular studies, and he held from poetry, and he said that somehow the Jewish world has to be modernized, etc. Well, in his time, that was anathema. And he wanted desperately to succeed his father-in-law as the rabbi in Prague. And the Chassidim and the more right-wing elements, let us say, in the community opposed him bitterly. Now, Yechezkel Levi Landau had a son, Shmuel Landau, who was also a tremendous Talmud Chacham. All these people are buried together on the new cemetery, and the Landau family has refurbished all of the graves, and they had a reunion of the family, 3,500 people, at the 200th yahrzeit of the Noda B'Yehuda about 8-10 years ago. And then they redid all the graves and all the monuments. It's really some fascinating thing to see. So Shmuel Landau, the son of the Noda B'Yehuda, became the president of the community. Not the Rav, but the president. And he engineered that his brother-in-law, Rappaport, should become the Rav of the community. Well, he became the Rav of the community, but he never had a moment's peace. Never had a moment's peace because of it. He was not maskil enough for the maskilim, and he was not religious enough for the religious, and he was not rabbi enough for the community, and literally he was hounded to his grave. So sometimes, I always remember what my Rabbi used to say, that when you pray for something, you should be careful, because maybe God is listening. He used to say, Tomer herta sich zu. Maybe he is listening, right? Maybe he'll give you what you ask. And not always what you ask is good for you. So they gave him what he asked for, but it was a disaster. It was a disaster for him and for the community as well. By the middle of the 1800s, Prague was no longer an Orthodox city. The Maskilim ruled it. It was half reform. There was an organ that was put into the Alt Shul and played on Friday nights. There were chorshum. It became modernized, and so then you had this tremendous rift within the community itself. But unlike Frankfurt, which I discussed last week, where Samson Raphael Hirsch took his community outside of the general community and therefore had the ability to do whatever he wanted to do, here everybody was together still. And therefore, because it's a little like here in Israel, right? Everybody's together. So, you have Meretz voting who should be the chief rabbi. Right? That's exactly what's happening. Everybody has a vote, whether you believe in it or not. And so because of this system of the community, there were constant difficulties, fights, all sorts of things that really did not help in the creation of a united community or of a strong community. The community was under the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Bohemia, Moravia, Slovakia was under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, under the Habsburgs. Maria Theresa, in the 1700s, she expelled the Jews for 4 years until her advisors finally talked her into it and let them back. You find in the old Machzorim, you find prayers for Maria Theresa yet. But I imagine that the Jews read the prayers Beloshen Saginoa, right? They didn't quite mean all of the blessings that they meant to give her. It's a story about the two Jewish ladies that fought all of the time and cursed each other, and the Rav in town couldn't bear it any longer. So Erev Yom Kippur, he called both of them in and he said, listen, we can't have this go on anymore. Whenever you want to talk to each other, you must bless each other. The Rav said, it's Erev Yom Kippur and everything, and he made them promise. What could they do? So they're walking home together after Yom Kippur, and one turns to the other and says, Freidel, you should be blessed, but you know what I mean. So it's the same idea here. You see these prayers for Maria Theresa, for the Emperor Joseph, the Jewish neighborhood was called Josephstadt, but they didn't mean to bless them. It was not a happy relationship. The best relationship with the Austrian government was under the reign of the Emperor Franz Joseph, who was for 75 years the emperor until when the First World War he died. And he, even though he was anti-Semitic, but he was fair about it. And he extended rights to Jews. He protected Jews. So the Jews had an affinity to him. The Jews had an affinity to him. And they even called him, Ephraim Yossel, they called him, right? And Franz Joseph. He was their man. And what would have happened had the Austrian Empire continued, no one knows. But it didn't continue. And after the First World War, Czechoslovakia became an independent republic. And was led by two people who, again, were from the Chasidei Umas HaOlam, Masaryk and Beinis. And they really did tremendous things on behalf of the Jewish people. And they were Zionists, and they were on the side of the Jews. but as we all know, Czechoslovakia fell to the Nazis in '39, and they were destroyed, and then his son Masaryk, the communists destroyed him. They pushed him out of the window in 1948, and it became a very, very difficult place for Jews to live, but there were always Jews there, even throughout the communist period. And there were usually 10 to 12 people that kept the minyan going at the Altnai Shul, but they were all members of the secret police. And they came to spy upon any tourists or anybody that came. But it was well known, so that when you went to shul, like you never talked to anybody, you never did anything. But when the communist regime fell, so then the community, as I mentioned, was restored to its property, and the Altnai Shul has been refurbished and exists today. There are 4 main synagogues that have survived out of the many, many that existed. So there's the Meisel Synagogue, and the Klaus Synagogue, and the Pinchas Synagogue, and the Altnai Shul. The other 3 synagogues, 2 of the 3 are museums. In one of the synagogues, in the Pinchas Synagogue, there still are services held on a regular basis. And in the Altnai Shul, there are services held on a regular basis. The Altnai Shul is naturally the attraction for tourists. People come there for Shabbos, etc. And they have many, many interesting customs. The last thing I want to talk about here tonight is the Golem. The Prague Golem. One of the most interesting things about the Prague Golem is that we never heard about him till about 100 years after the Maharal died. We have no contemporary record that there ever existed such a thing. But in the Jewish mind, the Golem took hold, and there are books about him, and biographies about him, and works of art about him, even though he may have been only a legendary figure, a figment of the imagination. But the Golem was a perfect example of what Jews wanted. They wanted to have somebody who could defend them, someone that was fearless, someone that the non-Jewish world would be frightened of, and someone who didn't care if he got killed. He's a Golem. He has nothing to lose, so to speak. And they attributed the Golem to the great Maharal, because the Maharal was the master Kabbalist and the great rabbi of Prague, and that's how this legend built up. So that there was a legend that the Golem lies upstairs in the Altnai Shul, and nobody can go in, because if you go in, anybody goes in is struck dead. But when they refurbished the shul, they went in and they didn't find anything. And so, but that doesn't change the legend of the Golem, and we have to live not only with facts, we have to live with legends as well. And that legend is one of the great legends of Prague. And they'll tell you, they explain minhagim, customs in Prague, on the basis of the Golem, even though the customs preceded, for instance, there's a custom, and with this I really will conclude, there's a custom that they say Mizmor Shir Le'om HaShabbos Friday night twice. Why? So that custom is mentioned already in Svarim of the Rishonim in the 11th and 12th centuries. There was a custom like that in Spain. There was a custom like that in Babylonia, apparently, that they said it twice. The Mizmor Shir Le'om HaShabbos. The first was like a warning, because after Mizmor Shir Le'om HaShabbos you can't do any malacha, no matter how early it is. So the first is like a warning, and then the second time is for real. But in Prague, the custom, they say, the reason they say it twice is that once the Golem went on a rampage Friday afternoon, and nobody could stop him, and he was wrecking everything, and they ran into shul, and in shul they already said Mizmor Shir Le'om HaShabbos, and only the Maharal could stop him, could take the parchment out of his mouth and make him immobile. So he ran out, the Maharal, and he got hold of the Golem, and he wrestled him, and he took the piece of paper out of his mouth so that the trouble ended. And then he went back and he said, now let's say Mizmor Shir Le'om HaShabbos. And they said it a second time. So today, in the Altnai Shul, they say it twice. And they'll tell you they say it twice because of the morale. And the fact, I spoke with the Rav, and the fact that I showed him where it's an old minig, he said it's an old minig, but the tourists don't like that. The tourists like this story. And it's true. People like the story. People like the legend. We live by legends as well. And Prague is a town that's haunted by legends, haunted by an old history of great troubles and great accomplishments. Thank you for coming, and we'll see you next week, God willing.